Jason Romano sat in his room, the glow of his laptop reflecting off posters of sleek cars taped haphazardly on his walls. The screen displayed a pearl-white Maserati Ghibli, its curves catching the light in a way that made Jason's chest tighten. To him, this wasn't just a car, it was freedom. It was proof that he mattered in a world where he often felt invisible. He imagined pulling into the college parking lot with music vibrating through the leather seats, every head turning. For once, he wouldn't be Anthony Romano's boy, or the kid who never finished what he started. He'd be Jason Romano, the one who made it, but the Maserati's price tag glared at him like a cruel joke. $70,000. A mountain he couldn't climb. His savings, what little he had from part-time work, barely covered insurance on his beat-up Honda. The frustration dug into his chest like a blade. I shouldn't have to wait. It's already mine, in a way. That thought had started small, a whisper he almost laughed off. But night after night, scrolling through online dealerships, the whisper grew into a certainty. His father had money. His father had promised him a future. Why shouldn't that future start now? Downstairs, he could hear the faint clinking of glasses, his father finishing his evening bourbon, the steady sound of someone in control of their life. Jason resented that control. Anthony Romano had worked 30 years in accounting, grinding quietly, never indulging in extravagance. He believed in savings, in patience, in lessons learned the hard way. Jason believed in none of that. Dad doesn't get it, Jason muttered to himself, clicking through pictures of the Maserati's interior. He doesn't know what it's like to want more than just ordinary. The next morning, Jason found Anthony at the kitchen table, the man's routine as predictable as the sunrise. Black coffee, newspaper folded neatly, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. His tie was already knotted, though it was only 7 o'clock. Anthony Romano carried the air of someone who lived in straight lines. Jason hovered in the doorway, nerves buzzing. He pictured himself behind the Maserati's wheel. Imagined the sound of admiration in his friends' voices. The words tumbled out before he could stop them. Dad, I've been thinking, maybe you could help me out with something big. I want to buy a car. Anthony lowered the newspaper, eyes narrowing slightly. A car? You already have one. Not like this, Jason pressed, sliding his phone across the table with the gleaming Maserati on the screen. I found the perfect one. I just need some help getting started. Maybe from, what's already mine. Anthony's brow furrowed, and Jason could feel the weight of judgment in that silence. Your inheritance? Anthony asked. Finally, his voice measured. Jason nodded quickly. Just an advance. I'll handle the rest. You've always said that money was for my future. Well, this is my future. This car changes everything. Anthony set the phone down as if it were contaminated, his lips pressed into a thin line, and Jason recognized the warning in that expression. You're 19, Anthony said quietly, and what you're asking for isn't responsibility. It's indulgence. Jason's cheeks burned, shame mixing with defiance. He stormed back upstairs moments later, pulse hammering, Anthony's disapproval echoing in his ears. On his desk, the Maserati's picture still glowed on the screen, mocking him. His father's words, irresponsibility, indulgence, looped like a curse. In Jason's mind, the dream car had become more than metal and glass. It was a symbol of freedom his father dangled just out of reach, and that denial, sharp and humiliating, planted the first seed of resentment. Jason barely slept that night. The hum of traffic outside his window only deepened the restless energy gnawing at him. He could still see his father's face, calm and immovable, as though Anthony Romano had already written his son's fate in stone. By morning, Jason was simmering. The Maserati's image haunted him. Sleek, untouchable, gleaming like a prize meant for someone else. He convinced himself that his father wasn't just denying him money, he was denying him dignity. Downstairs, the clatter of dishes marked Anthony's morning routine. The scent of bacon drifted up, mixing with the bitterness of fresh coffee. Jason descended, each step heavy, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Anthony sat at the kitchen table, still in his pressed shirt from the night before, reading glasses perched low. He looked up only briefly when Jason entered. "You're up, early," Anthony remarked, voice steady. Jason slid into the chair opposite him. "We need to talk, about the car." Anthony set his fork down, folding his hands neatly. "Jason, I thought we made ourselves clear last night." Jason leaned forward, frustration spilling out. "No, you made yourself clear. You didn't listen to me. I'm not asking for charity. I just want what's mine. My inheritance. You said it was meant for my future." Anthony's eyes hardened, but his tone remained level. "A future isn't a luxury car, Jason. A future is education, stability, a foundation you can build on. Not leather seats and speeding tickets." Jason's fists curled against the table. "You don't get it. You never have. You think I'm just some kid who doesn't know what he wants. But I know. This isn't just about a car. It's about respect. About finally being someone." Anthony's expression shifted, disappointment carving lines deeper into his face. "Respect isn't bought at a dealership. It's earned. You're chasing an illusion, and I won't fund it." The silence between them thickened, the ticking of the wall clock filling the void. Jason's chest heaved. His pride stung like an open wound. "Other fathers help their kids," he muttered bitterly. "Other fathers don't hoard everything until it's too late to matter." Anthony leaned back in his chair, staring at his son as though searching for the boy he once knew. His voice dropped, quiet but cutting. "You're not ready, Jason. Money in your hands right now would destroy you, and I refuse to watch you throw away everything on a shallow dream." Jason felt heat rise behind his eyes. It wasn't just rejection, it was humiliation. Every word from his father sounded like a verdict. Unworthy, immature, nothing. He slammed his chair back and stood abruptly. "Fine," Jason spat, his voice breaking. "Keep your damn money. I'll figure it out myself." Anthony didn't flinch. He simply lifted his coffee cup, as if the conversation was already over. Jason stormed, out of the kitchen, footsteps pounding against the hardwood floor. Upstairs, he collapsed onto his bed, face buried in the pillow. Anger swirled inside him like a storm without release. He replayed every second of the conversation, twisting Anthony's words until they pierced him. His father wasn't protecting him. He was belittling him, holding him back, denying him the one thing that could lift him out of mediocrity. Respect isn't bought at a dealership. The phrase echoed in Jason's mind, mocking him, drowning out reason. From the window, he could see the cracked driveway where his dented Honda sat. The sight of it, the rust, the peeling paint, was unbearable. Each floor screamed of failure, of being stuck, of never becoming more than what his father allowed. And beneath that fury, a darker thought began to take root. If Anthony Romano stood in the way of Jason's future, then Anthony wasn't just a father, he was an obstacle. Jason shut himself away from the world in the days that followed. The Romano house, once filled with the steady rhythm of ordinary life, became a battlefield of silence. Meals passed without conversation. Anthony remained composed, reading his newspaper at the table, sipping coffee as if nothing had fractured between them. Jason, meanwhile, lingered upstairs, headphones on, but no music playing, staring at the Maserati's photo on his cracked phone screen. The refusal had festered into something uglier. What began as frustration turned into humiliation, and humiliation hardened into rage. Jason's thoughts circled endlessly, replaying the kitchen conversation in distorted fragments. Every word his father had spoken seemed sharper with each recollection. "You're not ready. You're irresponsible. Money in your hands would destroy you." He began to hear those words in Anthony's voice, even when the man wasn't speaking, a ghostly soundtrack that gnawed at him while he tried to sleep. One evening, Jason sat in his darkened room, the only light coming from the glow of his laptop. The Maserati still gleamed on the screen, taunting him. He whispered under his breath, as though trying to convince someone, maybe himself. "I deserve it. I've waited long enough. I'm not a kid anymore." The whisper grew harsher. He doesn't want me to succeed. He doesn't want me to be more than him. The bitterness in his chest grew heavy, pressing on him like a weight. He thought of his friends, how they laughed when he pulled up in the battered Honda, how they compared him to kids with brand new cars, kids whose fathers opened doors instead of closing them. The thought stung worse than any insult. Downstairs, Anthony's presence was steady and maddening. Jason could hear the faint creak of the recliner, the steady sound of television murmuring in the background. The house was full of his father's order, everything stacked, folded, polished. Jason's own mess upstairs, the piles of clothes, the half-finished assignments, the empty cans, felt like rebellion. A rebellion Anthony would never acknowledge. At dinner, Anthony spoke little. And when he did, it was about work, about balance, sheets, about numbers that meant nothing to Jason. He avoided eye contact, but Jason could feel the disapproval radiating across the table. The silence wasn't peace, it was judgment. By the third night, Jason had stopped joining him altogether. He stayed upstairs, eating cold pizza out of the box, pacing the floor until the boards creaked beneath his restless steps. Shadows clung to the corners of his room, and in those shadows, his anger grew teeth. He began to imagine scenarios, walking into the kitchen, demanding the money again, refusing to be dismissed. He pictured Anthony's face twisted in shock, finally forced to take him seriously. But in every version of the fantasy, his father always won, always calm, always in control, always the one with the final word. That image was unbearable. Jason started skipping work shifts, ignoring calls from friends. The outside world no longer mattered. His life had narrowed into a suffocating triangle. His room, the Maserati's image, and his father's quiet presence downstairs. Lying awake one night, staring at the ceiling, Jason felt the thought creep in fully formed for the first time. The only way he'll stop controlling me is if he's gone. The idea shocked him at first. He sat up, heart pounding, as though someone else had whispered it aloud. But the more he tried to shake it, the more it settled, like poison dripping slowly into his bloodstream. And when his eyes drifted toward the corner of his room, where an old wooden baseball bat leaned against the wall, a relic from Little League, it was as if the shadows themselves pointed toward it. The bat had been in Jason's room for years, forgotten in the corner, its surface dulled by time. To most, it would have looked like nothing more than a relic of boyhood, a chipped Louisville slugger from Little League, its handle wrapped in peeling black tape. But to Jason, in those sleepless nights, it began to glow with strange significance. He remembered the summers when Anthony drove him to practice, the long evenings when the field lights buzzed against the dark sky. His father, always in his pressed work shirt, sat in the bleachers with arms crossed. Anthony never cheered the way the other parents did. His praise was measured, his criticism sharp. Keep your eye on the ball. Don't swing wild. Discipline. Jason, always discipline. Even then, the bat was tied to his father's expectations, a symbol of judgment disguised as guidance. Jason would grip it tightly, determined to prove himself. But no matter how hard he tried, Anthony's nods of approval were rare, fleeting, conditional. Now, staring at it in the dim light of his room, Jason no longer saw a piece of wood. He saw every failure, every dismissal, every moment when his father decided he wasn't enough. One night, Jason picked it up. The weight startled him. He had forgotten how solid it felt in his hands, heavier than memory suggested. He gave it a small swing, the air cutting with a soft whoosh. For an instant, he felt powerful, the way he had as a child when a hit connected and the ball sailed through the air. But the nostalgia curdled quickly. The sound of his father's voice intruded, harsh and unforgiving. "Not good enough. You need to try harder." Jason's jaw tightened. He swung harder, faster, until the bat struck the edge of his dresser with a hollow crack. The vibration buzzed through his palms, both painful and satisfying. He stood there, chest heaving, staring at the dent in the wood. The bat became his companion in the days that followed. He would lift it absent-mindedly, resting it against his shoulder as he paced the room. Sometimes he tapped it against the floor in a steady rhythm, a heartbeat of anger echoing through the walls. At night, he laid it across his lap while scrolling through car listings, the Maserati's image glowing on the screen, the bat's shadow stretching long across his bed. The more he held it, the more his thoughts twisted. He imagined walking downstairs, bat in hand, demanding once again what was rightfully his. He pictured Anthony looking up from his chair, his calm composure cracking at last. In those fantasies, Jason didn't just ask. He made his father listen. He made him afraid. One evening, Anthony passed Jason's open door and caught a glimpse of the bat in his son's hands. "You still have that old thing," Anthony remarked casually. Pausing in the hallway, Jason's grip tightened. "Yeah," he said flatly. Anthony chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Never thought you'd keep it. You always hated practice." The words stung more than Jason expected. He hated the way his father's voice carried casual dismissal, as though Jason's efforts had never mattered. Anthony continued down the hall, unaware of the storm he had just stirred. Jason stood frozen, the bat pressed against his leg, his mind replaying the comment over and over. That night, Jason lay awake, the bat propped against his nightstand like a sentinel. He imagined Anthony sleeping soundly downstairs, oblivious, untroubled. Meanwhile, Jason's thoughts tore at him, raw and relentless. He gripped the handle again, whispering into the dark. "He'll never respect me, not unless I make him." The bat, once a tool of boyhood games, had transformed in Jason's mind. It was no longer just wood and tape. It was power. It was rebellion. It was the instrument that could silence the voice of judgment forever. It was a Sunday afternoon when the tension finally split open. The Romano house buzzed with the chatter of relatives who had come by for a family lunch. Anthony's sister, Clara, a woman with a sharp laugh and sharper opinions, filled the kitchen with her voice. Plates clinked, the smell of roasted chicken drifted through the air, and Jason lingered on the edge of the room, restless and irritable. Anthony, as always, held court at the table. He carved meat with deliberate precision, answering Clara's questions about work, shaking his head at the news of rising mortgage rates. Jason sat slumped in his chair, scrolling absently through his phone, the Maserati's photo hidden behind casual swipes. Clara's gaze eventually landed on him. "Jason, what are you up to these days? School? Work?" Jason hesitated. "I'm figuring things out." Anthony gave a short, humorless laugh. "He's still trying to figure out responsibility," he said, not looking up from the carving knife. The words hit Jason like a slap. His aunt chuckled politely, mistaking the comment for a joke, but Anthony's tone carried the weight of truth. Jason felt his stomach knot, the heat rising to his face. "I'm working," Jason snapped. "I've got plans. Bigger than you think." Anthony finally looked at him, eyes calm but cold. "Plans aren't the same as action. You're 19, Jason. It's time to stop dreaming and start building. The world doesn't hand out respect just because you demand it." The room went quiet for a moment, Clara awkwardly adjusting her napkin. Jason gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice trembling with anger. "You've never understood." Anthony set the knife down, fixing his son with a steady look. "What I understand is discipline, and what I see in you, Jason, is waste. Wasted time. Wasted chances." Jason's chest tightened, the humiliation so sharp it almost stole his breath. Clara shifted uncomfortably, offering a forced smile. "Let's not argue," she said lightly, but the damage had already been done. The rest of the meal passed in silence for Jason. He barely tasted the food, his eyes locked on his plate, his ears burning with every word echoing in his mind. Waste, irresponsible, still a boy. Each phrase dug deeper, an invisible hand pressing him into the chair. When the dishes were cleared and Clara left with a cheerful wave, Jason retreated to his room. He shut the door quietly, but inside he exploded. He paced the floor, muttering, under his breath, fists slamming against the walls. He humiliates me, in front of her, like I'm nothing, like I'll never be anything. The bat leaned against the corner, waiting. Jason's eyes kept flicking toward it, drawn to its silent promise. He picked it up, swinging it through the air with violent force, the sound slicing the quiet. Wasted, he spat, the words shaking in his throat. He'll see. He'll see what wasted really means. That night, the house grew still. Anthony sat in the recliner downstairs, the television flickering shadows across his tired face. Jason lay upstairs, the bat resting against his bed, his mind consumed by the replay of his father's words. Something had shifted. The humiliation had hardened into decision. Jason could feel it, cold and certain, filling the space where doubt used to live. He closed his eyes, the bat under his hand like a talisman. In his imagination, Anthony's voice was finally silenced, replaced by the roar of an engine, the gleam of headlights, the world staring at Jason Romano, not as a failure, but as someone untouchable. For the first time, violence didn't feel like fantasy, it felt like inevitability. The Romano house exhaled into stillness that night. The relatives were gone, the dishes washed, the arguments swallowed by silence. Outside, the suburban street glowed under dim orange lamps, a quiet that seemed too ordinary for the storm brewing within its walls. Jason lay in his bed, fully dressed, his back pressed against the headboard. The baseball bat rested across his lap like an extension of himself. He stared at the ceiling, every muscle wired, the humiliation from earlier replaying in sharp, stinging flashes. His father's voice looped endlessly. Waste, irresponsible, discipline. Each word struck like a hammer, each echo fueling his anger until it became unbearable. He whispered to the empty room, his voice ragged. He'll never stop. Never. Unless I stop him. Downstairs, Anthony had fallen asleep in his recliner, a half-empty glass of bourbon on the side table, the television murmuring faintly with late-night news. His breathing was slow, heavy, the kind of sound that came from decades of long workdays. To anyone else, he would have looked peaceful. To Jason, he looked smug, untouchable, as though even in sleep his father judged him. Jason rose from his bed and began to pace, the bat dragging softly against the floorboards. The sound was muffled, but deliberate, like footsteps of something inevitable. He stopped at the mirror, staring at his own reflection. The boy who looked back seemed both familiar and strange, eyes sunken from sleepless nights, jaw tight, a tremor running through his hands. He tightened his grip around the handle. The bat felt warm now, alive. At one point, Jason sat at his desk, opening his laptop again. The Maserati glared back at him, its polished curves gleaming under showroom lights. He imagined himself gripping its steering wheel, the leather against his palms, the engine purring like a predator. The fantasy merged with the bat in his hand. Both were power. Both promised respect. Both meant freedom from his father's shadow. He slammed the laptop shut, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Minutes dragged into hours. Midnight. 1 a.m. 2. Jason's mind played and replayed the confrontation that hadn't happened yet. He rehearsed the words he might say, the demands he might shout, the moment his father's face would shift from calm certainty to fear. Sometimes, in his imagination, he spoke first. Give me what's mine. Other times, he said nothing at all. Just the swing, just the silence afterward. Each version left him trembling with adrenaline, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. At around 3 a.m., Jason crept to the top of the staircase, bat in hand. He listened. Below, Anthony's snores drifted softly from the living room, steady and oblivious. Jason stood there for what felt like an eternity, every step down seeming like a point of no return. He gripped the railing, sweat slicking his palms. Not yet, he thought. His body shook with both terror and anticipation. He retreated, pacing back to his room, but the idea had tightened its grip. Sleep was impossible. His mind was no longer his own. It pulsed with one single, undeniable conclusion. Jason sat again, on his bed, bat across his knees. The house was so quiet he could hear the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the occasional pop of the settling wood. Shadows stretched long across his walls, twisting into shapes that seemed to whisper to him. He ran his thumb along the dent from when he had struck the dresser days before. That mark felt like a promise, a rehearsal for something far larger. By dawn, Jason hadn't closed his eyes once. He sat in the half-light of morning, staring at the bat, his thoughts hollow and heavy. He no longer asked himself whether he could do it. The only question that remained was when. Jason sat in his room, the muffled laughter of his parents drifting up from the living room like an insult. He paced, fists clenched, the familiar posters of sports cars on his walls, no longer symbols of hope, but mocking reminders of what he didn't have. The red Ferrari pinned above his desk glared back at him, its glossy finish catching the dim glow of his desk lamp. He had asked politely, begged even. He had endured his father's lectures, his condescending advice, his moral superiority. But what had it earned him? Nothing but humiliation. Every no from Anthony wasn't just about money, it was about power. Jason could feel it now. His father relished holding the keys to his future, dangling them like bait only to yank them away. Jason ran a hand through his hair, trembling. His heart hammered as his mind replayed the earlier scene in the study, the cold finality of his father's words, the smug way he dismissed his son's plea. It's my money, Jason, and you'll have to earn your own. That voice echoed in his skull, sharp as broken glass. His gaze drifted toward the corner of the room, where his old baseball bat leaned against the wall. A relic of his little league days. It had once been a symbol of childhood triumphs, the pride Anthony carried in the stands as he cheered for his boy. But now, the bat stood like a shadow, tall and silent, its purpose warped in Jason's fevered imagination. He picked it up slowly, as though it were an extension of himself. The weight was familiar, almost comforting. He held it in both hands, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. He swung it experimentally in the air, listening to the faint whistle as it cut the silence. His breath came quicker. Why does he get to control everything? Jason whispered to the empty room. Why does he get to decide what I deserve? The questions churned into something darker. His father didn't understand him, never had. To Anthony, money was about discipline, about structure, about lessons. But Jason didn't want lessons. He wanted freedom, recognition, status. He wanted to walk into a parking lot and watch every head turn toward him. He wanted the life he saw on Instagram, the envy in his friends' eyes, the validation that had always slipped through his fingers, and Anthony stood in the way, always. Jason's hands shook as he lowered himself to the edge of his bed, the bat resting across his knees. A storm raged in his mind, a tug of war between guilt and anger. He could almost hear his mother's voice, her laughter, her endless attempts to keep peace between father and son. He thought of her tears if she knew what he was considering. For a moment, doubt flickered. But then came the memory of Anthony's dismissive smile, the smug curve of his lips as he dismissed his son's desires as childish. The doubt hardened into fury. Jason rose to his feet again, pacing the room, with the bat still clutched in his hands. His chest heaved, as though every breath was dragging him closer to inevitability. The silence pressed in until it felt unbearable. He stopped at the mirror above his dresser, staring at his reflection. The boy looking back at him seemed pale, haunted, yet alive with something he had never seen before, a dangerous clarity. "They'll see," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "They'll all see I'm not weak. I'll take what's mine." Downstairs, he heard the television click off, his parents moving about as they prepared for bed. Jason froze, ears straining at the sound of footsteps. His grip tightened around the bat, sweat slicking his palms. Each creak of the house seemed louder, more ominous, pushing him to a decision he knew he could not walk back from. He placed the bat back against the wall, just for a moment, just to breathe. But when he sat back down on the bed, the emptiness in his hands gnawed at him. The object had already taken root in his thoughts, whispering promises of control, of liberation. Jason lay back, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying 1,000 imagined scenarios. In every one, the obstacle was the same: his father. And in every one, the solution looked frighteningly alike. Sleep never came, only the relentless rhythm of rage. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the curtains, Jason's decision was no longer a passing thought. It was a plan. And in that plan, the bat was no longer a childhood relic. It was destiny. The house was quiet, deceptively quiet, as Jason stood over the living room floor. The baseball bat, still slick with blood, lay discarded at his feet. His chest heaved, sweat streaking his pale face, every breath harsh and shallow. The air smelled metallic, thick with the tang of what he had done. Anthony's body lay motionless in the chair, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, as if the world had ceased to exist. Jason knelt briefly, unsure whether he wanted to touch, to check for signs of life, or to escape into disbelief. Panic bubbled in his chest, clawing its way up. His hands trembled as he forced himself upright, stepping carefully over the evidence of his own rage. He couldn't linger. Every second spent staring at the scene made the reality heavier, more unbearable. "I can fix this," he whispered to himself, voice shaking. "I can make it like it never happened." Jason moved quickly, almost mechanically, wiping the bat with a damp towel, then dragging it toward the garage. Each step echoed against the hardwood floors, a reminder of how fragile his control was. He tossed the towel into the trash, hoping the stains would disappear before anyone noticed. In his mind, he rehearsed stories: a break-in, a heart attack, an accident. Anything but the truth. His eyes darted to the stairs. Upstairs, his room waited, a sanctuary now tainted by the weight of his actions. He realized he hadn't thought about the neighbors, the noises they might have heard, or the smell of blood that could cling to the air. Fear prickled along his spine. Jason stuffed Anthony's laptop and scattered papers into a box, trying to mimic disorder, to suggest haste or struggle. The living room rug bore the faint outline of footprints that could betray him. He knelt, scraping at the carpet with trembling fingers, but the fibers held the evidence stubbornly. The sound of the front door creaking startled him. He froze, heart pounding, and listened. It was only the wind brushing against the trees outside. Relief was fleeting. Every creak of the house now seemed amplified, each shadow a threat. Jason imagined the detectives arriving, the flashing lights, the questions. His thoughts spun faster, looping through every scenario he had watched in movies, every crime show he had obsessively binged. He needed alibis, explanations, signs that this was not premeditated. But the knowledge that his mind had been obsessively planning this for weeks made the thought of a perfect story laughable. He began moving in a frenzy, collecting anything that might tie him to the crime. A sock damp with blood, the towel still in the trash, the tiny scuff mark on the corner of the dresser from the bat. Every item was evidence, every detail a potential confession. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with blood that had dried on his hands. Jason paused in the hallway, catching his reflection in the mirror. The boy staring back at him was unrecognizable. Eyes wide, jaw set, expression hollow yet frenzied. He looked like someone who had crossed a line and could never return. The baseball bat, now discarded and still visible, seemed to mock him, a symbol of power and destruction in equal measure. No one will know. No one has to know, he told himself. The words sounded thin, brittle, hollow even to his own ears. He grabbed a plastic bag, stuffing it with bloodied clothes and a few of Anthony's personal items. The smell of iron clung to the fibers, and Jason gagged slightly but continued. Everything had to disappear. Everything had to be perfect. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. Dawn was approaching, light brushing against the edges of the blinds, and Jason finally collapsed on the couch. He could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, a mundane sound so incongruous with the horror he had created. He thought about the neighbors, the inevitable investigators, the possibility of the truth coming out. Anxiety clawed at him, like a predator circling its prey. And yet, amid the panic, a small part of him, the part that had been consumed with entitlement, with obsession, felt a grim satisfaction. He had done what he believed necessary. The dream, the car, the respect. He had crossed the first threshold to claim it. But as the adrenaline ebbed, leaving him trembling and hollow, Jason realized the truth he could not escape. Nothing could ever be the same. Not the house, not his father, not him. The cover-up had begun, but it was only the first act of a story that would spiral far beyond what he could control. Detective Carla Hughes had been on the force for 14 years, and, in all that time, she had learned one immutable truth. The smallest detail could crack open the largest lies. That morning, she pulled into the quiet New Jersey cul-de-sac, her car humming softly, a sense of foreboding settling in her chest. The Romano house stood like any other suburban home, pristine, well-kept, deceptively normal. But the call had raised her instincts. Something about the situation didn't sit right. Inside, Anthony Romano's neighbors had reported hearing strange noises the previous night. There was no forced entry, no signs of burglary, and yet the call came in as a welfare check. Carla felt the first tickle of unease as she stepped into the foyer, shoes quiet on polished hardwood. The living room smelled faintly of iron, and Carla's eyes immediately landed on the scene. There was a sense of stillness in the air, oppressive and unnatural. Every object seemed slightly out of place, the chair tilted, the papers scattered. But nothing screamed crime loudly enough for an inexperienced officer to notice. For Carla, the irregularities were glaring. She crouched to examine the floor. A faint outline of footprints trailed across the rug, smudged and uneven. Someone had tried to clean, but the effort was sloppy, the evidence subtle but present. Carla's experience told her that whoever had done this was familiar with the house and unconsciously left traces of panic. Carla straightened and scanned the room. She noted the baseball bat propped in the corner, oddly clean compared to the rest of the chaos. Her gaze lingered longer than necessary. The bat didn't belong there. It seemed almost staged, placed in plain view as if daring someone to touch it. She walked to the staircase, hearing the soft creak of steps above. "Hello," she called, voice calm but authoritative. No answer. Carla's eyes swept over the upstairs landing. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar. She stepped in carefully, noting the empty bed, the scattered clothes, and the faint smell of sweat and adrenaline. A gut feeling settled in her chest. The person who had been here was still in the house, and they were hiding. Carla returned downstairs, calling for backup while continuing her methodical examination. She noted inconsistencies in the room, the positioning of furniture, the way light reflected off surfaces, the subtle disturbances in dust and carpet fibers. Every detail told her one thing: this was not a random act. It was personal, calculated. She imagined the psychology of the resident, someone close to Anthony, someone with intimate knowledge of the house, and the baseball bat resting in its corner was no coincidence. The instrument of trauma had been handled deliberately, not carelessly. By mid-morning, Carla's instincts had pieced together a rough outline in her mind. The perpetrator had tried to cover tracks, but fear had betrayed them. The house told a story in its silence. A relationship twisted by resentment, an act of violence born from obsession, an attempt at erasing guilt that could never succeed completely. Her thoughts turned toward Jason Romano, Anthony's 19-year-old son, a child grown too fast, raised with entitlement and a fragile ego. Carla had seen it before. Young adults pushed past emotional thresholds, finally erupting in irreversible acts. She didn't yet know the extent, but she felt it like an undercurrent, electric and dangerous. Carla knelt again, tracing the faint streaks across the floor. "This isn't random," she murmured to herself. "Someone close, someone who knows him, someone who feels wronged." The words echoed, almost like a warning. She could almost hear the tension in the walls, the panic that lingered in the air. Every detail pointed toward a son consumed by entitlement and rage, a family fractured in ways only a seasoned detective could read. As she stepped back, Carla's phone buzzed. Backup was on the way, but she remained in the room, eyes scanning every inch. The house's silence pressed down on her. Somewhere upstairs she sensed movement, a shadow that didn't belong, a presence hiding, watching, waiting. Detective Hughes knew instinctively that the investigation had only just begun, and that the truth, dark and brutal, was hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The house felt impossibly still. The silence was no longer comforting. It pressed down, heavy and accusing. Jason sat on the edge of his bed, the baseball bat leaning uselessly against the wall. He had spent hours pacing, imagining, rehearsing, but now the finality of what he had done settled over him like lead. The adrenaline had faded, leaving only the raw weight of guilt and fear. Downstairs, Detective Carla Hughes moved with careful precision. She had traced every detail, every subtle mark of panic, and she knew the perpetrator was still somewhere in the house. Each step she took, each observation she made, tightened the invisible noose around Jason's chest. Jason could hear her approach. Every creak of the floorboard sounded amplified, like a drumbeat heralding his own undoing. He gripped the bat instinctively, though he knew it would mean nothing. It was no longer a tool of power, but a reminder of his irreversible mistake. Fierce thought of escape crossed his mind, fleeting and desperate. But he realized the front door would be locked, and the neighborhood would already be alert. There was nowhere to go. "It's over," he whispered to himself, his voice hollow, almost a confession. Carla paused at the top of the stairs. "Jason Romano." Her voice was calm, controlled, but it carried authority. "We need to talk. Now." Jason's fingers tightened around the bat, knuckles white. For a moment, the fantasy of defiance surged. The image of his father alive, of power and respect, finally his. But it crashed instantly against the reality of the detective's presence. She was patient, unflinching, a force he could not intimidate. He placed the bat on the floor, its weight suddenly meaningless. I didn't mean to," he stammered, the words tasting foreign and bitter. Carla descended slowly, every step measured. "Jason," she said, her voice steady, "we know what happened. It's time to be honest. The more you try to hide it, the worse it gets." Jason's mind raced. Every rationalization, every twisted justification felt thin and exposed. The humiliation, the obsession with the car, the anger at his father, they all culminated here, and suddenly, none of it mattered. Only truth remained, harsh and unyielding. I hit him," Jason admitted finally, voice breaking. I didn't want to. I lost control." Carla listened carefully, noting the tremor in his voice. the avoidance in his eyes, the trembling of his hands. "It's over now," she said gently but firmly. "You need to come downstairs with me." Jason nodded, tears running unchecked. He took one last look at the room, at the Maserati images on his walls, at the bat that had promised empowerment and delivered devastation. The fantasy of status, of respect, had evaporated, leaving only emptiness. Downstairs, the scene of the crime loomed, horrifying and undeniable. Anthony's body, still and pale, confronted Jason with the full weight of his actions. He could no longer pretend, no longer escape into imagination. The reality was relentless. Carla guided him gently but firmly. "It's going to be okay," she said. "You'll have to face consequences, yes, but you did the right thing by telling the truth." Jason's knees buckled as he sank into a chair. The gravity of the moment consumed him. The loss of his father, the betrayal of his own morals, the irreversible nature of violence. Every anger, every frustration, every fantasy that had driven him here seemed insignificant now, dwarfed by the enormity of reality. As paramedics and officers arrived, Jason recounted everything, step by step, voice quivering. Carla's presence was steady, her calm a tether to the storm raging inside him. He realized that the dream car, the respect he had sought, the power he thought he could seize, none of it mattered anymore. Only accountability remained. The sun rose higher, casting a cold, impartial light over the suburban street. Windows glinted, lawns were washed in clarity, and the world outside moved on, indifferent to the tragedy within the Romano house. Jason, however, could not move past it. In the weeks that followed, legal proceedings unfolded. Jason's confession, combined with the meticulous observations of Detective Hughes, left no room for doubt. The trial was swift, the verdict inevitable. Justice, in its procedural and moral form, was delivered. Yet even with judgment passed, the emotional aftermath lingered. Jason's youth, his entitlement, his fragile ego, they were all shattered irreparably. Anthony's absence was a wound that would never fully heal. And in the silence of his cell, Jason finally understood the cost of obsession, the destructive power of unchecked rage, and the permanent consequences of a single, violent choice. The cell was silent, except for the occasional shuffle of feet in the corridor. Jason sat on the narrow cot, staring at the grey walls, the ceiling, the shadows that shifted like ghosts across the corners. Time moved differently here, slower, heavier, as if each second carried the weight of everything he had done. The baseball bat, once an instrument of fantasy and power, had been long taken away, leaving only the memory of its cold weight in his hands. He thought about his father, not with the anger that had consumed him, but with a muted, painful clarity. Anthony Romano had been stern, controlling, unyielding, but he had also been human. He had loved Jason in the only ways he knew how, through discipline, expectation, and hard lessons, and Jason had rejected it, twisted it, weaponized it. "How fragile I was," he whispered. "How blind." The news reports had circulated quickly. The story of Anthony Romano's murder, committed by his own son, made headlines for weeks. Neighbors, friends, and distant relatives struggled to reconcile the image of the Romano family they had admired with the tragedy that now defined them. Jason had become a symbol of obsession gone too far, a cautionary tale whispered in suburban streets and online forums alike. He tried to reconcile who he was before that night with who he had become. The fantasies of luxury cars, admiration, and power seemed almost laughable now, childish, meaningless. The Maserati, the Ferrari, the envy of his peers. They were distant, hollow ambitions that had led to real-world carnage. He thought of Detective Carla Hughes, the steady presence that had guided the investigation. Her words echoed in his mind. "You did the right thing by telling the truth." At the time, he had clung to them like a lifeline, a thin thread of hope in a world gone dark. Now, he understood them in full. confession didn't erase consequences. It only allowed for a sliver of moral clarity, a chance to confront oneself honestly. Jason's reflections were interrupted by the routine of prison life, the clang of gates, the call to meals, the distant murmur of other inmates. Yet even amid this monotony, the psychological weight of what he had done pressed relentlessly. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by flashes of that night. The glint of the bat, the shock in his father's eyes, the metallic taste in the air. He began to write, at first, just disjointed sentences, fragments of memories and feelings, attempts to externalize the guilt that burned inside him. Slowly, the words became a narrative, a chronicle of a life gone wrong. Each line was a reckoning, a forced confrontation with the choices that had led to ruin. Through writing, Jason discovered a strange form of control, the ability to map out his own failures, to examine the entanglement of obsession, entitlement, and rage that had consumed him. He realized that violence had offered nothing, not power, not respect, not freedom, only absence, silence, and irrevocable loss. On occasion, a guard would walk by, nodding politely, and Jason would think of his mother and his aunt. He imagined the grief, the shock, the irrevocable shift in their lives. He could never reach them. Now, never undo the damage. His punishment was not just confinement. It was the knowledge that the love he had taken for granted was gone, replaced by fear, sorrow, and betrayal. By the end of the week, Jason understood the lesson too late. But, with brutal clarity, life, respect, and affection were not things to demand. They were earned, nurtured, preserved. And in his pursuit of superficial validation, he had destroyed the only person who had ever tried to guide him, the only life he could never reclaim. He closed his eyes, letting the shadows of the cell engulf him. No redemption could erase the past. No dream could replace what was lost. But in reflection, he found something like understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of consequence, of the dark trajectory of obsession, and the moral weight of one's choices.